In 1918, a doctor could do exactly one thing for a child with diabetes: starve them, slowly, on purpose. Some children survived an extra year that way. Most did not survive at all. By 1923, a boy who once weighed less than a golden retriever was back in school, playing baseball, laughing with friends. The only thing that changed was a few milliliters of clear liquid injected under his skin. But insulin's story does not start in a hospital. It starts inside a dog named Marjorie, a coin flip between two college friends, and a filing cabinet full of failed experiments that nobody wanted to admit had already cracked the answer. Picture a small lab in Toronto in the summer of 1921. No air conditioning. The smell of animal blood and ether hanging in the air. A young surgeon with no research experience, no PhD, and no idea if any of this would work, standing over an operating table with a scalpel in his hand. He is about to tie off a duct in a dog's pancreas. He does not know it yet, but he is holding the answer that had eluded the smartest doctors on Earth for 3,000 years. Diabetes is ancient. Ancient Egyptian physicians described it thousands of years ago, long before anyone understood why. Doctors in ancient India and China wrote about it too. A Greek physician gave it the name we still use, describing how it made the body pour out fluid like water through a siphon. For nearly 2,000 years after that, doctors could describe diabetes perfectly. They just could not stop it from killing. This is the part most people never learn about. Before insulin existed, the treatment for a child with diabetes was starvation. Physicians in the early 1900s put patients on brutally restricted diets, sometimes as low as a few hundred calories a day. It slowed the disease down. It did not cure anything. Children on these diets did not die of diabetes. They died of hunger, just a little more slowly than they would have died of the disease itself. Parents were told to watch their children waste away in two different ways and pick the one that bought a few more months. Scientists had a theory for decades before insulin existed. They believed the pancreas made some kind of substance that controlled blood sugar. The problem was proving it. Researchers around the world tried and failed to isolate it. Their extracts were too impure. Patients developed fevers, abscesses, violent reactions. One French physiologist even sealed his findings in an envelope and left it unopened for over a decade, unsure if his own results were real. And that is where everything changed. In October 1920, a young orthopedic surgeon named Frederick Banting was reading a medical journal article about pancreatic duct blockages in preparation for a lecture. Banting was not a diabetes expert. He had a failing medical practice in a small Canadian town and was teaching anatomy on the side just to pay rent. But an idea hit him in the middle of the night, and he scrawled it into his notebook with 2 words misspelled. If you tied off the duct that carried digestive enzymes out of the pancreas, the enzyme-producing tissue would wither away. What would be left behind were the islet cells, the ones suspected of making the missing substance. For the first time, someone might be able to isolate it without the enzymes destroying it first. He took the idea to a professor named John MacLeod at the University of Toronto. MacLeod was not impressed. Banting had no publications, no doctorate, and no laboratory experience. But there was a problem with saying no. The idea was sound, even if the messenger wasn't the one MacLeod expected. MacLeod gave him a small lab, 10 dogs, and a summer student to help with the surgeries. That student's name was Charles Best. He got the job because he won a coin flip with his roommate. The work began in May 1921, and it was ugly. Dogs died on the operating table. Blood sugar tests failed. Banting and Best were so inexperienced that they had to teach themselves surgical technique as they went, sometimes buying stray dogs off the street because the university's supply ran out. MacLeod left for a research trip to Europe for most of the summer, leaving 2 amateurs completely on their own with a theory nobody had proven in 3 decades of trying. On July 30, 1921, it finally worked. They injected a pancreatic extract into a diabetic dog and watched its blood sugar plunge in front of their eyes, dropping from dangerously high all the way down to normal in about 2 hours. They gave the extract a name: Altin. But there was a problem. Dog pancreases were not going to be enough to treat human beings. So they switched to slaughterhouse cattle, and they still had a purity problem so severe that early extracts caused abscesses and fevers instead of cures. In December 1921, a biochemist named James Collip joined the team. He had the exact skill Banting and Best lacked: the ability to purify the extract into something clean enough and strong enough to risk on a human body. Behind the scenes, tension was already building. Banting was furious that MacLeod took over a public presentation of their work because Banting, by his own admission, was a nervous public speaker. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The relationships between these 4 men would fracture within 2 years, right at the moment the whole world was celebrating them as heroes. On January 11, 1922, a 14-year-old boy named Leonard Thompson became the first human being ever injected with a pancreatic extract meant to treat diabetes. It barely worked. It caused a sterile abscess at the injection site and did almost nothing to his blood sugar. What followed was something nobody expected. Collip went back to the lab and refined the purification process. 12 days later, on January 23rd, the improved extract was tried again. Leonard's blood sugar had been sitting at a life-threatening level. Within a single day, it dropped by nearly 3/4. His glucose in the urine disappeared. A boy who had been slowly dying in a hospital bed was, for the first time in medical history, being brought back by an injection instead of a diet. Word spread fast. A girl named Elizabeth Hughes had been living on a starvation diet of well under 1,000 calories a day since she was 11 years old. By the time she reached Toronto to receive the new treatment, her weight had collapsed to around 21 kilograms. That is lighter than an average 7-year-old. She started insulin therapy, and her body came back to life. She went on to marry, have 3 children, and live for 58 more years. And the consequences are sitting in the arm of nearly every person on Earth living with diabetes right now. But insulin's reach was about to expand in a way nobody could have imagined. Word of the discovery crossed the Atlantic within months. In 1923, a Danish physiologist named August Krogh traveled to the United States on a lecture tour. His wife had recently been diagnosed with diabetes, and the two of them kept hearing rumors about a miracle treatment out of Canada. Krogh detoured to Toronto, secured the rights to manufacture insulin for Scandinavia, and went home to found a laboratory that would one day become one of the largest insulin producers on the planet. This is where insulin stopped being a lab experiment and became a global industry almost overnight. The University of Toronto owned the patent, but the 4 men behind the discovery had refused to get rich off it. Banting and his colleagues sold the American patent for $1 each, a symbolic price meant to keep the treatment from becoming a monopoly for profit. Banting reportedly said something that has been repeated for a century since. Insulin did not belong to him. It belonged to the world. For centuries, most medical breakthroughs stayed locked behind patents, prices, and borders. Until this one didn't. At least, not at first. Later that same year, Banting and MacLeod were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. And that is when the celebration turned bitter. Banting was outraged at best. The student who had assisted him through months of failed dog surgeries was left off the prize entirely. He nearly refused to accept it. Within days he announced he would split his own prize money with Best. MacLeod, feeling the pressure, did the same, sharing his half with Collip. 4 men had saved millions of lives together, and the prize committee could only officially recognize 2 of them. The wound never fully healed. MacLeod eventually left Toronto for a university job overseas, worn down by years of arguments over who deserved the credit. But there was still a massive problem waiting on the other side of that Nobel Prize. A treatment is not the same thing as a supply. And in the mid-1920s, the world did not have nearly enough insulin to treat everyone who needed it. Eli Lilly, the American pharmaceutical company that partnered with the Toronto team, began mass-producing insulin from animal pancreases collected at slaughterhouses. It was crude, and it was inconsistent. Early batches varied in strength by as much as a quarter from one lot to the next, meaning a patient could not always trust that yesterday's dose would behave the same way today. A new purification method eventually cut that variation down substantially, but for years, dosing insulin was closer to guesswork than modern medicine. There was another problem nobody had solved yet. Early insulin only worked for a few hours at a time. That meant patients were injecting themselves multiple times a day, every single day, for the rest of their lives. In the 1930s, a Danish chemist named Hans Christian Hagedorn figured out that adding a protein called protamine could stretch insulin's effect out to a full day or longer. Researchers in Toronto found that adding zinc extended it even further. These discoveries reshaped daily life for millions of diabetics, cutting a burden of constant injections down to something people could actually live with. By 1978, insulin took its strangest turn yet. A team at a biotech company called Genentech figured out how to make human insulin using genetically engineered bacteria, essentially hijacking E. coli to manufacture the exact hormone a human pancreas would produce. In 1982, that lab-grown human insulin hit the market under the name Humulin, becoming the first genetically engineered drug most people had ever heard of. 60 years after a 14-year-old boy got an abscess from a crude cattle extract, patients were injecting a molecule built inside bacteria in a factory instead of extracted from an animal at all. By the 1990s and 2000s, scientists had gotten good enough at tweaking insulin's molecular structure to design versions that acted faster or slower on purpose. A version called Lispro hit the market in 1996, designed to act almost immediately after a meal. Others followed. Long-acting versions were engineered to release slowly and evenly across an entire day, mimicking what a healthy pancreas does in the background without anyone thinking about it. One company even tried an inhaled version so patients could skip needles entirely. It flopped. The device was bulky, patients didn't like it, and it disappeared from the market within 2 years of launching. By the 2000s, everything had changed. Insulin had gone from a dying boy's last chance to a globally manufactured, endlessly engineered product used by tens of millions of people every single day. And almost none of it happened the way the four men who discovered it had hoped. This is the part that should make you angry. Banting sold the American patent for $1 because he believed insulin belonged to the world, not to a company's balance sheet. For most of the 20th century, that spirit mostly held. But starting in the early 2000s, something shifted in the United States. A handful of manufacturers, controlling nearly the entire global insulin supply between them, began raising list prices year after year, sometimes in lockstep with each other, on a drug that cost a small fraction of its sticker price to actually manufacture. Families who had been managing type 1 diabetes for decades watched their monthly insulin bill climb into the hundreds of dollars, then close to $1,000, for a medication that has existed since the 1920s and should, by now, be cheap. Some patients started rationing. Stretching doses meant to last a month across 6 weeks or longer. Diabetic ketoacidosis, the same condition that killed children before 1922, started showing up again in emergency rooms, not because the medicine didn't exist, but because people couldn't afford the dose sitting on the pharmacy shelf. Public pressure eventually forced change. Some manufacturers introduced price caps. Lawmakers in several U.S. states, and eventually at the federal level, moved to cap out-of-pocket insulin costs for many patients. But the fact that any of it was necessary, on a 100-year-old hormone, is its own kind of indictment. Land in the present, and insulin is quietly hiding in plain sight in more places than most people realize. It is in the pump clipped to a teenager's waistband at school. It is in the tiny sensor taped to someone's arm at the gym, silently reporting blood sugar to a phone in their pocket. It is in the pen tucked into a work bag, the vial in a lunchbox cooler, the refrigerator door of nearly every household managing type 1 diabetes on Earth. Roughly a century after Leonard Thompson's second injection, insulin is not a rare miracle drug reserved for the desperate. It is a daily, unglamorous, absolutely essential tool that tens of millions of people depend on to see tomorrow. And in dozens of countries, from wealthy nations with modern healthcare systems to some of the poorest regions on the planet, access still is not guaranteed. It is not just one country's story. It is a global one, and it is still being written. Insulin's story spans more than a century, 3 continents, and some of the most dramatic moments in the history of medicine. It was there in a dying boy's hospital room in January 1922, when a second injection did what the first one couldn't. It was there on a Nobel Prize stage in 1923, wrapped in celebration and bitterness at the same time. It was there in a Danish laboratory in the 1930s, quietly stretching a few hours of relief into an entire day. And it is here now, in a pocket, a refrigerator, a pump strapped to someone's hip on their way to school. A boy once weighed less than a child half his age because there was nothing else doctors could do. A scientist gave away a patent because he believed a discovery this important could not belong to just one man. A hormone born in a Toronto dog lab now travels the world in a cooler bag, keeping millions of hearts beating on schedule. And somewhere, right now, someone is opening a refrigerator door, reaching past the milk, and pulling out the same idea that started in a notebook with 2 misspelled words in 1920.